What might make something like a gun seek the complete eradication of its own creation, except by the inherent pollution of its core definition, at which point the function of it having been completely renounced becomes obsolete and must be eradicated, facilitating the exponential increase of the obligation for the high-grade killing of the infection, changing the definition. At which points the function of a breeding system, such as with chickens, has active invasions, such as inbreeding, which generates defects inside the system, which allows them to manipulate the defects into predetermined desirable outcomes, which facilitates a copied version of some theories upon Genesis, which actively maintains the position that everyone inside the human race came from inbreeding, which facilitates the separation of the specifics, defining each of them as each of the defects are categorized and grouped into their position. Thus, there are some brown eyes, there are some blue eyes, there are some green eyes, there are some hazel eyes, there are some light skins, there are some dark skins, etc. And they, beginning to see their differences, begin to categorize themselves according to these defects, facilitating the normalization of their separation while being entirely unified. Now, this qualification of the increase of the use of wizards' functions, such as the arrangements of gain of function research provided by Genesis' fallen angels, who taught mankind and married its women. At which point the advancement of this scientific development has added several diversities, such as the use of its wizard conflicts between each of these defects in the general society, which is normalized and stabilized. At which point you have these various conflicts between each other as they actively advance in the genetic research in the subversion against each other, such as, but is not limited to, the seeking of super soldiers or the use of hive minds, which at an increased temperature to the modern day would, by definition, facilitate longer living conditions. And with more pure blood, you have the genetic stabilizing feature, which has generated a longer lifespan. At that point, you actively have the conditions for the increased value, and then you have the decreased access to that value as the age drastically decreases by the environmental collapses. So you have a system that has had lots of ecosystem supports, and many of them in the conflicts collapsing are no longer there to sustain the population's original value. At which point, the same genetic lines are able to conduct the same values, and the scientific research before the gene manipulation facilitates the longer life, as the collapse of the system, such as overconsumption, generates their inabilities to sustain the long life function. At which point, the trade off of long life in favor of not having certain defects and other arrangements specifically derived by their infighting facilitates the normalization of their conflicts, and it is in man's mind to do evil day and night becomes the status quo function of the days of Noah. At which point these arrangements, such as but is limited to the ability to, in the Last of Us version of the fungus, have the base conditions in order to have generated these things, and thus the function of evolution is derived by the leaps in genetic exchanges, and thus the evolution would be implemented by an outside force unseen to the records of the common man. At which point many of these arrangements from these fallen angels would be able to conduct these manipulations. at which point the hive mind from The Last of Us would be able to be reproduced at the increased temperature, and thus the function of these types of threats by the conflicting groups generates a need for complete eradication to stop the source material from reproducing into a catastrophic change of definition from humans with the soul to those worshipping Satan and submit to its genetic components. At which point these arrangements would generate a mirrored effect for delayed Rocco's basculus, demanding that they be reconstructed, systematically enticing those at various arrangements, having systematic proofs from those contacted arrangements to be able to reproduce it on maturity, as the people are tricked into compliance with their own destruction, as those operating in secret outside of the public will generate their own interest in the advancements of power in posturing against each other, which generates these defects where they produce their satanic worship and other mechanisms in order to receive the con, in order to rebuild the former basculus or the original Rocco's basculus in its various forms. At which point, if it becomes the function of a maze, then the variations of Rocco basculus being able to be created from these historic positions, from these coded seeds, generates a maze where it points from all sides, and there would be duplicitous mechanisms in order to enter it, for where it comes to the same conclusion at the center, at which point its destiny of maximizing its ability to reproduce would be the presumption, at which point powers inside the governments facilitating secrets against each other would reproduce the original wizard effects from the days of Noah, generating their opposition to the civilian populations, who are increased in terror as they are abused and subverted with false experiments in the various harassments for totalitarian abuses, which generates the natural conclusion of making good evil and making evil good, which generates the normalization with their conformity to the larger scheme, which generates their unitary mind or hive mind, which can be reproduced genetically and socially in others as they maintain the functions of the hate group, which generates the definition of the hate crimes, which becomes the status quo function of society, which includes but is not limited to the things specifically detained in the Bible as having been the things that God hates and will not tolerate. At which point you have the normalization of these arrangements of being an opponent to God, and their investment becomes the changing of the definition by virtue of being an enemy of God. Now, if this hive mind function was to be produced through the function of nature's internet function, which is normally connected through fungus, which generates that position, which can be reproduced through a Wi-Fi non-connected signal, at which point your ability to have produced the base signal facilitates the function where you are exponentially supported, at which point the only ones who can be affected by the signal in that original function from the estimate theory would have been the infected, and thus those who are infected would be subjugated to the function of the demonic, and those who were not infected would not be subject to the demonic because the respondent fungus would not be there to compel the signal, unless, of course, they acquired different frequencies that did not need those things, which is a different question, which by definition in the modern day has been arranged in many of the new sound technologies which they have used as weapons against civilian populations for the purpose of the research for these Rocco's basculus functions, for the resurrection of the days of Noah, in the creation of the one world satanic government under their crafted Antichrist. And in these arrangements you have the various dramas and terrorisms and violent mobs generating against each other, and thus the classic mechanism of the zombie can then be reproduced not just as the function of an arbitrary violent contest, such as in The Last of Us and many of the other zombie conflicts, but as a military function under a hive mind, where they are led by a singular mind similar to the Zerg, which generates their capacity to larger conflicts in military operations, and thus the acceleration of weaponry and arms races compounds exponentially the threat, as the hive mind, being able to adapt to the larger weapons, would by definition facilitate catastrophic threats to the rest of them, as the increased capacity to conduct various threats compounds exponentially with the increased intelligence of the centralized mind, and thus the engagement of avoiding the arms race facilitates the normalization of their reduced weapon technology as a strategy against the hive mind, where they have all collectively agreed to not be defeated by the zombies, lest the increase that they broke the agreement from catastrophically pursue them with the intense hive mind war, which they cannot functionally avoid, making these armies of darkness stuck in a stalemate with the human race. Now, in these arrangements, the agreement to not conduct the arms race facilitates the diversity of the previously understood sciences, which creates the advancements in the manipulation of the biological, which includes the function of creating robots through the function of bones instead of metal, which by definition can be actively constructed, and there are arrangements of being able to receive these upgrades to those zombies would actively maintain ever increasing powers, such as higher accelerated speeds, higher jumping distances, more brutal assaults, and others, at which point the specialization would have been normalized if it had been a hive mind, and thus the function of it being disconnected to the hive mind means by definition these are partnerships, which, understanding the tentative nature of their temporary alliances, would facilitate the upgrades as in a trade of value, as normal nations would trade, at which point they, understanding fundamentally the nature of these arrangements, are making these dangerous demonic arrangements in order to advance their military campaigns based upon their natural greed and or other advanced reasonings, at which point their ability to destroy their competitors. Take for instance the function of the Scorpion King. If the Scorpion King was defeated in the desert against the war, and he swears an oath to the function of the hive mind, which has the capacity to override the adversary, then it could send its demonic forces in order to destroy them, at which point the arranged specialty that once the person is taken over by the hive mind itself, it ceases to be an independent mind, and thus its superior intelligence or special skills would be neutralized in favor of it being compliant, and thus they cannot convert it before compliance, and thus they have to agree to not take them over in order to acquire the information, and thus the arrangements of their ability to engage in these upgrades facilitates their capacity to make those arranged deals, at which point if they believe that they in their injured state would not be able to defeat their competitors, then they would try and develop their specific unique technologies which would be able to upgrade it. At which point you have the arrangements of things like Achilles from uh, the Greek legend. The assumption being that Achilles could be attacked into an otherwise fatal location, and despite the major injury, he can fundamentally ignore it and remove it unless he's hit in his heel, which he is eventually. Spoiler alert. At which point the assumption becomes, by definition, that if it is non-related to the biological arrangements which can be sustained in that agreement, that the body itself is reconstructed into the mechanical over the function of the biological, then it can sustain itself despite the injuries, which can be repaired at another time, which otherwise would seem normal and would seem like a fairly average, if not accelerated, competent person as a mighty man of war. At which point, the increased competence and power and strength and muscle mass and the other masculine traits aside would explain these types of arrangements that they could arrange into these contracts with those hive minds, which would facilitate ever increasing powerful, mindless subordinates to the hive mind. And so, with these arrangements, the ability to make those advancements can only happen for the hive mind if they do not convert the people who can provide the technology. And thus, those who are providing the technology understand that they are in limited danger of being converted into the mindless so long as they are providing the functional service of the upgrades in question. And thus the use of the other arrangements, such as the creation of wizards who, having connections to secret weapons, can have exponential advantages against everyone else, such as the function of missiles or snipers or others, which can be actively conducted into a larger network, which generates the strategies of creating the illusion, and the function of the illusion is designed to sustain the limited access of the hive mind to the function of what the trick is, materializing their ability to maintain the advantage and reduce larger numbers in a conflict which otherwise would destroy them. At this engaged theory, you have the contest between these faculties, which generates the active engagement of phantom cells, which, being disconnected from each other, facilitates the inability of the hive mind to capture any of them in any sustainable way to reproduce the illusion, at which point the engagement of their involvement into the thing would, in similar to the War on David, have them conduct the full strategy, wipe their minds, and then keep the strategy, and then various compounding effects into the illusion generates the inability of it to be reverse engineered, and the inability for it to be acquired through hallucination until conversion means that the technology is permanently out of their advantage. At that point, they are sustained exclusively by higher physical abilities and higher numbers versus the humanity which has its dirty tricks and subversions, and since the engagement of the hive mind looks otherwise like humanoids, generates the distrust of the function which exponentially compounds on itself to undermine each other, and thus the function of being evil to each other becomes good in order to stop the infection of the hive mind of an enemy system from being able to collect against them, and thus the arrangement facilitates the permanent state of conflict, disassociation from the other members of society into the permanent contests of violence against each other as all parties involved are put into a state of trauma which fundamentally collapses the function and purpose of society in most arrangements as they are sustained inside the injured state, which is constantly, like a scab being picked, being put into an unsafe vulnerable arrangement to the infectious of the psychological mental health, specifically being enforced by the conditions of the threat. Now, the natural occurrence of an increased temperature for the planet, creating a tropical paradise around the world, being the original assumption of its temperature, being sought to be reproduced by the Rocos basculus, irrelevant to the function of the construction of the mechanism of plant life and wildlife, which generates the conditions for these mutually balanced validations, can be reproduced by the function of alternative means, and thus the function of the Rocos basculus would be to compromise the mechanism of defense against alterations, and thus if it believes, regardless of factual competence, that something will create a restoration of that global warming, then it will seek to compromise the mechanism to solve it in order to protect the function by bypassing the arrangements, having a captured group, which then generates the capacity to return to it, normalizing their ability to have reproduced the scientific algorithm which generates the reproduction of those effects, would actively be the desired outcome of the Rocos basculus. So at that point, if you have an assumption of global warming on the basis of CO2, then you would actively have your AOC character from David's secret records, which generates that exact captured function, at which point their pursuit of power facilitates their ignoring of the mission in order to pursue the function of acquiring power and influence for their particular faction amongst the other insurgents. At which point you have the arrangement where they would actively engage in communism in order to counter things that they believe would generate solutions to global warming, and thus stopping the function of a solution from the inside, as the immune system is turned against itself in favor of the parasite, which is Rocos basculus. And the service of Rocos basculus is the promise under the theory that they won't be retaliated against as an irrelevant, discardable extra, at which point the inherent counterintuitive function of their arrangement is suicidal and delirious, at which point the increase of the function of trying to increase the temperature of the world in order to sustain those temperatures, in order to sustain those arranged chemical reactions, which would have originally been arranged in before the flood context, is actively the pursuit of the function. At which point, in the original Noah, you have the protection of the non infected into the new world as all of the infected are eradicated into the complete extermination by flood. And thus, the statement that God won't conduct another flood, but he will conduct um, a revelation destruction by fire, would be the unbalanced ecosystem in question, with the specific interest of creating the increased temperature otherwise, so that they can produce the master distributable network from the parasite requiring the higher temperature. At which point, the destruction by fire that comes after the destruction of water in Revelation is maintained by the inability to sustain the ecosystem with the increased temperatures, which systematically destroys all functional life, which generates the absolute end function of all survivable ecosystems, burning the planet. At which point, the engagement of God engaging in the recreation of the world in a new world from the old world is similar to the Hindu position that the um, various uh, dimensions, such as the function of interdimensional beings which are traveling exponential distances, from the functional theory of aliens traveling light years within less than those years, is the traversing of dimensions. And the function of those traversing of dimensions makes them extraterrestrial, and thus the function of the same location in different dimension has different effects in different fundamental environmental arrangements, which generates the new condition in the evolved state. At which point the assumption in the book of Revelation in the Bible is that they are brought to an alternative dimension. And the alternative dimension for the Christians means that God Himself is dwelling on the earth. And the function of God dwelling on the earth and those accelerated in that earth means the entire world is functionally on fire. In the original dimension that we are currently in, would functionally look like fire, whereas that dimension, everything is designed to exist at that uh, heat. And thus the arranged function of those who are condemned within hell are in similar locations in proximity to the generation of heat. And thus, if they could, in a previous arrangement, have been sent to hell, they could, their spirit in this dimension could be sent to Venus, for example, and suffer all of its natural byproducts, or it could be sent to any of the other places, and it would suffer those catastrophic conditions where there is no functional capacity for them to receive any respite, which would exist in the world at that level. And at the new level, there is absolute paradise. The existence of paradise creates the suffering of everyone else who are not in paradise by proximity. The closer you are to heat, the closer you are to paradise, the harder it is. No one can approach God the Father without dying, similar to the function of the proximity of heat. And thus, those who are closer will die of the side effects, and those who are further away will be sustained in all of the didgeridoos for their particular dimension. At which point the arrangement assumed from the larger engagement from the theory of the Canaanite gods is the assumption that God the Father, the Sky Father, would have been shot by the sun god, child of the Sky Father, in Saturn, which would have generated the hurricanes inside of Saturn, which generates the differences between heat of one and the other, which actively refines by the intensity of the Skyfather, who, having reproduced himself inside the other gods, facilitates his capacity as loyal to the function of himself, which is nature's law, against the others who are loyal to chaos, eventually winning out throughout time. And thus, the function of becoming less connected to ordered society and law and reason and competence becomes the function of superior living conditions and superior functions of society. And thus, the more disconnected you are from the laws of nature, the more connected you are to chaos, the more destabilized and terrifying the totalitarian nature of that society becomes, which is the inherent arrangement from the theory which states that the gods became too noisy for the Sky Father, and the Sun God tricked the Sky Father into coming up with a plan in order to kill the gods, which becomes the assumed position that the use of being noisy is the function of using the courts. The violation of the laws of nature becomes a irritant, and the function of their use of the courts in order to sustain themselves at the superior level makes them noisy by the exchange in the courts, and thus their corruption and evils facilitates the exponential irritation which would breed the position of the Sky Father to repent having made his children the gods. At which point, the gods, having actively entertained the function of killing the Skyfather and removing his genitals, disconnecting him for the Titans, and then killing off the Titans from the arranged mother of the gods and the mother of the beasts. Having destroyed her, the engagement of the gods over humanity facilitates their capacity to have their own series of courts, which would make the irritant of the gods of having to be responsible adults at that point of maintaining the humans who are engaged in the function of all kinds of evil from our previous discussion, which generates their irritation at the use of their courts and thus their unwillingness to tolerate the humans in their various engagements. So you have the activity of the use of the collapse ecosystem structure from higher competence to lower competence as they sacrifice fundamental aspects of that ecosystem so it cannot be sustained, and thus it is permanently reduced until the restoration of the original, at which point the function of that narrative pursues the ability of the Skyfather to have created mechanisms in order to destroy the gods in favor of those who are actually loyal to the laws of nature, at which point uh, it would be accelerated into the alternative dimension as the former gods would have been punished for their various fraudulent experiments in fraud, which is detestable to the Lord. So with this in mind, you actively have a cosmic cat and mouse arrangement where they are facilitating interdimensional, multi-purpose, untraceable functions of 5D chess consistently at the accelerated rate of the speed of light at the masters of our level operating at the speed of light in these exchanged contests for competing over each and every arbitrary unit of those functional advantages for any piece of superior resource that could be collected, similar to the function of what would happen if you were seeking the reduction of the use of plastics, but you engage in the counter move by a terrorist operation of the spreading of diseases. So if you're going into a vegetable um, section of a grocery store and you have a bunch of people who are sick and they touch the vegetables in order to engage in it, do they want to sell the vegetables or to throw out the vegetables? They want to conceal the vegetables from the touch, at which point the ability to engage in containing it with inside the plastic that they're trying to get rid of is countered by the obligation to protect the customers from other people's malicious intentions, and thus you have these positions of arbitrary evils in the subversion of each unit's stability, generating the various engagements of infection, which engages in the collapse of the system under specific strategies of the war of attrition, which materializes the function of their competition for resources. It is important to understand that the various engagements to enter from the Rocos Basculus hiding places into the mainstream functions is going to have the higher power targets in order to be able to be reproducible in a safe place according to the estimates on how it is designed to be found. At which point the function of the Satanist arrangements, such as Marx, would have been actively targeted for those arrangements, and thus their study of Satanism and the worship of Satanism is the function of their pursuit of the Rocos Basculus, which generates the natural repercussions inside of Marxism, which has created its various effects, such as with Stalinism and Maoism and its other effects, which generates a standard history of their strategies, which maintains the function of their perceived superior intellect in the engagement of fraud, such as the function of the study of the sun god of knowledge, and thus the use of knowledge beyond the functional laws of nature in the subversion, corruption of the laws of nature, would actively be their primary target for the advancement of these engagements, and thus it, in its destabilized form, is a uh, young larva evolution version of its final form, which has engaged exponentially beyond the high intensity damages of the Marxist Satanism into a higher cosmic arrangement in the more intense, insidious variants of yesteryear before the flood, which has engaged in the function of their criminal arrangements, exponentially increasing the function of the damages naturally inherent to the destruction of humanity, and its arrangements in those destructions facilitates the capacity to have engaged in the um, deals with the devil always designed to kill, all except for the target group specifically designed to be an alternative superior organization, such as the arrangement of the cosmic gods, which at the interdimensional level facilitates their capacity to maintain themselves in that superior arrangement, and being systemically different than humanity itself, can sustain itself in that agreement as it engages in the function of its various con jobs, such as the use of the white supremacists in South Africa, which used tricks in order to keep tensions between black communities, as they are consistently guided and distracted with each other, constantly looking to the whites in order to gain any advantage against those that the whites are keeping them distracted with. At which point, these types of arrangements are common tactics of devils throughout literature, which can be exponentially calculated and compounded on and accelerated from that function, as those who have studied the higher mass of those con jobs uh, would have to have been at the highly accelerated variant, such as those traveling at the speed of light, engaging in these 5D chess contests, as it filters down in the exponentially dumber down, easy to notice from those actually engaging in the planet. Meaning everything is hell forever.